What if a single photograph could hold an entire life, hidden in its shadows? In the grand wedding portrait of the Whitfield family, taken in Charleston sometime in the 1850s, everything appears perfect. The fine clothes, the proud smiles, the frozen dignity of wealth. But near the edge of the frame, half hidden by light and distance, stands another figure. A young woman in plain dress. Her gaze steady, her presence almost accidental. No one knew her name. No one asked why she was there. More than a century later, historians would begin to search for her tracing ledgers, letters and forgotten records, uncovering a story that stretched from bondage to freedom, from silence to remembrance. The pendant around her neck, once dismissed as ornament, would reveal a language older than the world that enslaved her. Tonight, let's step back into that photograph and listen to the quiet voice that history tried to erase, the woman who refused to disappear. At first glance, the photograph appeared ordinary, another portrait of a wealthy Southern family. But when the lens drew closer, when the faint shadows in the corner were revealed, a secret, long buried, began to stir. The photograph arrived at the Charleston Historical Society inside a weathered leather portfolio donated by an estate sale coordinator who hadn't even looked inside. Margaret Hayes, a preservation specialist, carefully lifted the sepia-toned print from its sleeve. It showed a family of clear prosperity, a stern man in a dark suit, a woman in a lavish silk gown, and 3 children arranged neatly on the steps of a grand columned mansion. It looked like countless others from the 1850s. Another glimpse into the pride of the pre-Civil War South. Margaret had catalogued dozens of such portraits before, yet something about this one made her hesitate. The composition felt intentional, too precise. An unusual amount of empty space lingered near the bottom of the frame, as if the camera had captured something it shouldn't. Curious, she placed the photograph beneath the digital microscope and slowly magnified the image. And then she froze. There in the lower right corner stood a figure almost lost in shadow. A young black woman half concealed behind a pillar, her face turned slightly away as though she wished not to be seen. Unlike the family posed proudly at the center, she seemed caught by accident, a ghost within their perfect world. Margaret's hands trembled as she zoomed in further. The woman wore a plain dark dress, her hair covered with a simple cloth. But it was her expression that struck deepest, a haunting mix of sadness, fear, and quiet resignation. Suddenly, the portrait was no longer a symbol of wealth. It was evidence, a whisper of a story the world had tried to forget. Margaret photographed the magnified section and sent it to Dr. James Richardson, a historian who specialized in antebellum South Carolina. He arrived within hours, his usual composure replaced by quiet urgency. "Do you understand what this means?" he said softly, leaning over the microscope. Enslaved people were rarely photographed, and when they were, it was only to flaunt ownership. But this woman, she wasn't supposed to be here at all. Together they examined the portfolio again. Behind the photograph, pressed between brittle pages, was a fragile newspaper clipping, dated 1856. It announced the marriage of Mr. Robert Whitfield and Miss Catherine Morrison, 2 of Charleston's most distinguished families. The photograph had been their wedding portrait. Margaret began tracing the Whitfield name through census records and property ledgers. Robert Whitfield had owned a rice plantation 20 miles outside Charleston and a townhouse on Meeting Street, the very mansion seen in the picture. According to the 1850 census, he claimed ownership of 43 enslaved individuals. No names, of course, only numbers, ages, and gender. Finding the identity of the woman seemed impossible, but James had an idea. "Look closer," he murmured. And under magnification they noticed something extraordinary. Around the woman's neck hung a small pendant, barely visible, but distinct. A simple metal circle, etched with strange markings. "If we can identify that pendant," James whispered, "we might uncover her story." Some enslaved people carried small tokens, gifts from loved ones, or hidden symbols of resistance. This might be our only clue. Margaret felt a chill. This was no longer simple research, it was an act of remembrance. A chance to restore a voice history had silenced. The next morning, she and James drove to the old Charleston Library, where colonial-era documents were kept in climate-controlled vaults. The librarian, an elderly woman named Ruth, listened intently to their request. "You're looking for domestic servant records in the Whitfield household?" she asked, pulling a heavy ring of keys from her drawer. Most families didn't keep such details, but the Whitfields, they were meticulous. "Follow me." She led them down a narrow staircase into the archives. Dust floated through beams of dim light as Ruth unlocked a massive iron cabinet and drew out several leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and whispering with age. Somewhere within those fragile records, a name might be waiting. A name that had waited nearly 2 centuries to be spoken again. "These are household accounts from the 1850s, Ruth murmured, brushing dust from the fragile cover. "If the woman you're looking for worked inside the house, her name might appear here." Margaret opened the first ledger with care. The brittle pages were filled with endless columns of numbers. Lists of fabric, food, furniture, and household expenses. Nothing unusual. Until on page 47, she found something different. A list of names. Hannah Kitchen, Sarah Nursery, Grace Laundry, Eliza Lady's Maid. 15 names in total, the domestic slaves who had served within the Whitfield townhouse. Unlike the field workers on the plantation, these few were valuable enough to be recorded by name, but there were no descriptions, no ages, no notes to help distinguish one from another. James photographed each page while Margaret cross-referenced every name with census records, wills, and city archives. Hours passed in silence until Ruth returned, holding a thin stack of papers. "I found something in the municipal records," she said softly. A legal dispute from 1857 involving the Whitfield estate. Margaret and James exchanged a glance. Ruth spread the document on the table. It was a formal complaint. Catherine Whitfield accuses a neighbor of attempting to purchase her lady's maid Eliza without permission. Below it, a physical description for legal identification. Margaret leaned closer, her pulse quickening. Female, approximately 20 years of age, medium height, distinctive circular pendant worn at all times, a gift from her mother before separation. They had found her. The woman in the photograph was Eliza. With her name confirmed, the search deepened. Margaret and James turned to the personal correspondence of Catherine Whitfield. preserved at the South Carolina Historical Society. Her letters to her sister in Virginia revealed fragments of a household's hidden life and the uneasy bond between mistress and servant. In one letter dated May 1856, Catherine wrote, "Eliza remains the most competent of my servants, though I confess she possesses a stubborn disposition that requires frequent correction. She performs her duties adequately, but maintains a troubling silence as though her mind dwells somewhere far beyond these walls." Another letter from December that same year told more. "Eliza appeared distressed this morning, though she would not say why. I later learned from Robert that her brother had been sold to a cotton broker in Georgia. She asked permission to bid him farewell, which I allowed, though Robert insists I am far too lenient." The letters painted a quiet tragedy, a young woman forced to serve a woman who saw her as both indispensable and less than human. As Margaret read Catherine's casual references to Eliza's suffering, the centuries between them seemed to collapse. James found further traces in the Charleston slave market archives. An entry from 1848 recorded the sale of a woman named Ruth and her two children Eliza, aged 12 and Samuel, aged 9, to Robert Whitfield's father. When the elder Whitfield died in 1852, the family was torn apart. Ruth was sold to a household in North Carolina, while her children remained behind. The pendant. Margaret whispered suddenly. In the description it said her mother gave it to her before they were separated. Eliza had worn that small circle of metal for at least 4 years before the photograph was taken, her only link to the mother who had been taken from her. They sat in silence, the air heavy with realization. That photograph had not merely captured a family's pride, it had preserved a story of endurance, of loss, and of defiance, whispered in stillness. To understand why Eliza had appeared in the image at all, Margaret and James began to reconstruct the events of the Whitfield wedding day. Newspaper archives described it as the social event of the season, with over 200 guests gathered at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, followed by a grand reception at the Whitfield townhouse. Reports mentioned the couple had commissioned a respected photographer, Samuel Barnwell, to create a formal portrait, an extravagant undertaking in the 1850s. Photography in those days demanded patience. Subjects had to remain perfectly still 30, sometimes 40 seconds as light etched their image onto glass. Eliza wasn't supposed to be there, James murmured, studying the photograph again. Look at the family's posture, centered, deliberate. But she's at the edge, half hidden. She must have stepped out for a moment, perhaps to deliver something, and the shutter caught her before she could retreat. Margaret turned again to Catherine's letters, and there, hidden between faded lines of ink, she found a detail that changed everything. The photographer arrived precisely at 3 o'clock that afternoon, though Robert insisted they delay. The light must be perfect, he'd said. Catherine recorded the moment in one of her letters. We arranged ourselves upon the steps, while the servants saw that everything appeared flawless. Now the timing made perfect sense. Eliza must have been moving back and forth between the house and the reception area, ensuring the celebration unfolded smoothly. For just an instant, she had stepped into the frame, an uninvited witness to a scene that represented everything she herself had lost. But when Margaret studied the photograph under extreme magnification, she noticed something else. Eliza's face wasn't turned away out of deference or fear. Her gaze was fixed on something or someone just beyond the camera's edge. There was focus in her eyes, not just sorrow. "She's looking at her brother," Margaret whispered suddenly. Samuel. The letter had mentioned he was sold 6 months later in December 1856. That meant he was still there on that day, perhaps standing just outside the frame. The photograph had frozen the final moment between two siblings, a fleeting connection the Whitfields never even knew existed. Margaret became consumed with understanding the pendant. It had to mean something more. She reached out to Dr. Lisa Chen, an anthropologist who specialized in the material culture of enslaved communities. Lisa traveled from Columbia to Charleston, bringing with her boxes of reference materials and a portable analysis kit. Under her expert lens, the pendant revealed itself to be far more than a simple ornament. "This isn't just decoration," Lisa murmured, peering through a jeweler's loop. "Look closely inside the circle. These are Adinkra symbols from West Africa. This one, Sankofa, means to go back and fetch it, to reach back to the past in order to move forward." The discovery struck them both silent. Ruth Eliza's mother had given her daughter not merely a keepsake, but a message, a symbol of memory, identity, and defiance. In a world built to erase their heritage, Ruth had made certain her child carried a piece of it within her. Lisa photographed the pendant from every angle, comparing it to museum artifacts. She explained that such tokens were often crafted by enslaved metalworkers, artisans who in secret repurposed discarded tools, old coins, or scraps of brass to create small emblems of endurance. To make and wear such an object was in itself an act of rebellion. Margaret later uncovered a journal entry from a plantation overseer, dated 1840, complaining of trinkets and charms worn by the Negroes despite strict prohibition. The system had sought to control every breath, every thread of their existence, and still these quiet acts of cultural survival endured. Now Margaret understood. When Eliza stepped into that photograph, she wasn't merely wearing her mother's gift, she was carrying a declaration of self. A quiet reminder that she was more than property, more than a servant in a borrowed house. She belonged to a lineage, to a culture that stretched far beyond the confines of bondage. The Whitfields had never noticed. The pendant never understood its meaning. But Eliza knew. Every day she wore it close to her skin, a small, silent act of defiance. Determining what had happened to Samuel became their next task. James immersed himself in dusty ledgers, bills of sale, and auction records across South Carolina and Georgia. Weeks passed before he finally found the entry, buried deep within a ledger at the Georgia Historical Society. December 12, 1856. Received from R. Whitfield, one Negro boy, Samuel, aged 17, healthy, suitable for field labor. Paid the sum of $900. Transferred to Oakwood Plantation, Burke County, Georgia. The buyer was Thomas Crawford, a cotton planter, notorious for his brutality. Samuel had been sold from the relative safety of domestic service in Charleston into the punishing fields of rural Georgia. Then Margaret found another letter from Catherine Whitfield, dated January 1857. Eliza has become increasingly melancholic since her brother's departure, she wrote. She performs her duties mechanically, but with no spirit. Robert insists I maintain discipline, though I confess the change in her troubles me. What Catherine perceived as melancholy was grief. A grief she could neither name nor understand. The loss of her brother was the final thread that bound Eliza to her family, and when it broke, something within her went silent. The wedding photograph, taken 6 months before Samuel's sale, now carried a weight far beyond its elegant composition. It had become evidence that once upon a time they had still been together. James uncovered one more chilling fragment of the past. A letter from Thomas Crawford to Robert Whitfield, dated March of 1857. It read in cold, practiced ink, "The boy Samuel you sold me has proven unsatisfactory. He attempted escape twice the second time, nearly reaching the Savannah River before capture. Appropriate discipline has been applied." Margaret's hands trembled as she read those words. The language was businesslike, detached, yet behind it lived unspeakable pain. He never stopped fighting. "James," whispered his voice, barely audible. Even when they tore him away from her, he tried to come back. That Margaret thought was courage in its purest form. Love, refusing to surrender. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Charleston changed, and with it, the Whitfield household. Margaret traced Eliza's name through fragile ledgers and fading newspapers. In 1862, as Union ships tightened their blockade around the harbor, the Whitfields fled to their plantation beyond the city. Catherine's letters spoke of the move. "We departed with only essential servants. Eliza, of course, accompanied us, as I cannot manage without her assistance, but the plantation offered no sanctuary." By 1863, the Union Army held the coastal islands, and whispers of freedom drifted inland. That June, Harriet Tubman led the Combahee River Raid, freeing more than 700 enslaved people from nearby plantations. Among the names recorded at a Union camp on Port Royal Island in July 1863, Margaret found her Eliza, approximately 27 years old, escaped from a plantation near Charleston. She wore a distinctive pendant, and she asked for help to find her brother in Georgia. Margaret read the document over and over as if afraid it might vanish. She made it. She breathed. She escaped. In Reverend Mansfield, French's notes the missionary wrote, "This woman shows remarkable intelligence and determination. She wishes to travel to Georgia to find her brother, but understands the danger. I have advised patience." Even in freedom, Eliza's thoughts were of Samuel. James continued the search through the post-war records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Thousands of newly freed people had placed small advertisements in newspapers. Desperate messages searching for family, lost to the trade. Then, in a fragile issue of the Colored Tennessean from September 1865, they found it. Information wanted of Samuel, last known to be at Oakwood Plantation, Burke County, Georgia, before the war. He would now be about 26 years old. Any information, please. Direct to Eliza Freeman, Port Royal, South Carolina. Eliza had chosen Freeman as her surname, her declaration of freedom. Finding out what became of Samuel consumed Margaret's thoughts. She combed through bureau letters, church registries, and the first post-war census. The answer came not from a government file, but from a church, a modest African Methodist Episcopal chapel in Augusta, Georgia. Its records from 1866 listed a marriage, Samuel Whitfield, formerly enslaved, age 26, married to Clara Johnson, June 3, 1866. Witnesses Reverend Thomas Carter and Eliza Freeman. Margaret sat back, tears pooling in her eyes. Against all odds, through war, through chains, through miles of separation, they had found each other again. Later records revealed Samuel's path his escape from Oakwood Plantation, during Sherman's March, his work as a carpenter in Augusta, and the moment when a friend placed a newspaper in his hands, the one with Eliza's plea. Church archives showed that Eliza remained near him, part of a small community of freed families along the Savannah River. The 1870 census listed her name Eliza Freeman, age 34, domestic worker literate. She had learned to read and write her voice, finally her own. James found one last letter, Samuel's written in 1867, to the Freedmen's Bureau. He requested help to obtain land. My sister Eliza, he wrote, who never stopped searching for me, still wears the pendant our mother gave her before we were separated. That symbol of Sankofa, reaching back to retrieve what was lost, brought us together again. The pendant had seen everything: separation, enslavement, escape, and at last, reunion. A simple circle of metal had carried across generations a whisper of defiance and love. When Margaret curated the exhibition Unseen Lives, Stories Hidden in Plain Sight, she placed the Whitfield wedding photograph at its center. Around it hung the document's letters and traces of Eliza's life. Her mother's gift displayed in its own glass case labeled Pendant C. 1848. Symbol of resistance and family connection. Some descendants of the Whitfield family attended the opening. A few looked uneasy. Others stood quietly humbled by the truth. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moment came when Patricia Thompson arrived, a woman from Atlanta, whose great-great-grandmother had been named Eliza. Standing before the enlarged photograph, Patricia whispered through tears, I always heard stories of an ancestor with a pendant separated from her mother and brother. But we never had proof. Never a face. Now here she is. The exhibition drew national attention. Newspapers told the story of the forgotten woman who had stepped by chance into the edge of a photograph and in doing so, into history. Scholars began to look again at old portraits, wondering who else had been waiting there unseen. For Margaret, the work had become something far greater than research. That single image, once a simple wedding portrait, had become a quiet monument to endurance. Eliza had not been meant to appear in it. She was supposed to remain invisible, a shadow at the margins of someone else's story. And yet, there she was. Her pendant still glimmered faintly, even in the faded tones of the photograph, a symbol that had outlasted slavery itself. Its message, Sankofa, had come true to reach back and carry forward what must not be forgotten. Now, whenever someone gazes upon that photograph, their eyes no longer fall first upon the wealthy bride or the proud groom. They see her Eliza standing quietly at the edge of history, her gaze steady, her presence eternal.